data. My name is Charlotte Dreisen, and I'm a project manager with Green Blue, one of the founding members of the Composting Collaborative, along with the U.S. Composting Council and BioCycle. We're going to be starting our webinar in just a moment. I'd like to let everyone know that we currently have phone lines muted to ensure good sound quality, but please, throughout our presentations, feel free to send on questions for our speakers in the Q&A in the lower left-hand corner. If you don't currently see the chat box, feel free to click Show Chat in the button on the top left of your webinar window. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to remind everyone that our webinar will be recorded, but the recording will be sent out in December after the residential access study is published in BioCycle. So everyone's getting a sneak peek today, but we'll be sure to pass on slides for the first portion of the webinar focusing on state processing capacity in the near future. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have some really exciting work to talk about today, and we're pleased to have Nora Goldstein, editor of BioCycle, which without a doubt all of you are intimately familiar with already. Brenda Platt, director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and who leads the Composting for Community program, as well as Virginia Streeter, who's a research associate in ILSR's Composting for Community program. Nora, I'd love to pass it on to you so we can get started.
Wonderful. Thank you, and welcome everybody. And it struck me the other day that we're about to celebrate the first year anniversary of the launch of the Composting Collaborative. There was a meeting in Washington, D.C. almost exactly a year ago, and it's been exciting to see the evolution of the collaborative, and encourage everybody to check out the compostingcollaborative.org website if you're not that familiar with the initiative. This afternoon, I'm going to discuss the 2017 nationwide BioCycle survey, State of Organics Recycling in the U.S. This report was released in October, and there was a preview in the October issue of BioCycle, and then for those who subscribed to the magazine, you had the opportunity to download the report in its entirety. Just a quick background on what the report entailed. We did data collection starting December of 2016 and went all the way through June 2017 before we got as much information as we knew we could gather. We utilized a one-page snapshot questionnaire. We asked questions about both composting and anaerobic digestion, and across the spectrum of organic waste streams from municipal, agricultural, industrial, commercial, institutional. In the end, we had 43 states respond, and the District of Columbia respond with questionnaires. Almost all of the data was from calendar years 2015 through 2017. We sent the survey to our contacts primarily in state solid waste agencies, and a few where we already had contacts with those who may really be overseeing anaerobic digestion. But because we were sending it to the state solid waste agencies, not too many of those offices had data on anaerobic digestion specifically. A handful did, but they all did provide information on how their states, or just about all, on how their states are regulating AD. So we supplemented, especially on the anaerobic digestion side, with in-house BioCycle data, and worked with a few state associations and organizations, and then also a couple national ones. So here's the big picture. We calculated, based on 35 states reporting, that 21.1 million tons of organics are recycled via composting and anaerobic digestion within the last 12 to 18 months, but let's just say on an annual basis. So that's only 35 states reporting. So clearly that's an undercounting. The total number of composting facilities in the U.S., this reflects all states except West Virginia, where we could not extract any data, 4,713. As far as anaerobic digesters, 265, and that includes livestock manure and standalone digesters, for example, a standalone food waste or food waste plus yard trimmings digester. We calculated 133 wastewater treatment plants, digesters doing co-digestion. That's where they take in high-strength organics, including food waste, fats, oils, grease. A separate survey by the Water Environment Federation and the American Biogas Council puts that number closer to 180. So I think it's safe to say we're not quite at 200, but they're definitely that's a moving number. So just focusing first on composting, as I mentioned, we counted about 4,700 facilities. The bulk of them are yard trimmings, 57%, followed by multiple organics, which I'll explain in a minute, and then on-farm, on-site at institutions, biosolids. Mixed MSW has stayed the same, it seems, 11 facilities year in and year out. And this is what the data looks like. Sorry, I just realized I'm not in full screen mode. Oh, hang on. Apologize for that. So in 2013, BioCycle was contracted to collect data on composting facilities in the U.S. for the Institute for Local Self-Reliance's State of Composting in the U.S. report. We used a similar survey form focusing just on composting. So this table compares, in the left-hand column is the new data, the 2017 data, and in the right-hand column is 2014. So you can see there's been, in terms of total number of facilities, a decline of about 200 facilities counted. One of the more dramatic lower numbers is the number of yard trimmings, composting sites, and this is explained in the report, but there's just states that reported a fairly high number in 2013. In some cases, it was half that amount in 2017. Yard trimmings plus food waste in 2017, that was 249, and we define yard trimmings plus food waste as source-separated food waste, but that also can include soiled paper, corrugated, compostable products. In the 2013-2014 survey, we specifically asked for source-separated food waste. Because when tallying up that data 4 years ago, there were these random facilities that were taking a mix of organics, not mixed waste, but mixed organics. And so in the 2017 snapshot survey, we specifically asked about multiple organics. So this is beyond just food scraps and yard trimmings, but can include those feedstocks plus manure, industrial organics, and other. And so it's interesting to see that that number comes in at 620. A couple other things I just want to point out before moving on is that the on-site institutional and the on-farm composting, those numbers are very much undercounted, and the main reason is that in many of those instances, especially with the on-site institutional, they're exempt from any kind of regulation or permitting, and therefore it's difficult to track them on a national basis. Similarly, many farm composting facilities are exempt from permitting. So just as far as some specifics about the facilities, far and away, windrow composting is the most utilized method. This is with 34 states reporting. So about 1,135 windrows. Static pile is the next at 409, aerated static pile 170, and in vessel 81. We did not ask that question in 2013, but it's in other surveys we've done that it tracks pretty much that way. To get a sense of the size of composting facilities based on the amount of material throughput annually, we changed up the threshold between the 2014 State of Composting and the 2017 State of Organics Recycling, and it primarily affects the mid-scale. We upped it to 30,000, less than 30,000, whereas 3 years ago it was less than 20, and then the larger was plus 30 or plus 20. And again, significantly, the bulk of the composting operations in the U.S., this is based on 36 states reporting, is by far the largest sector, largest scale, followed by mid-scale. We don't know if the drop between the two different surveys between and the mid-scale is because we changed the threshold, or if that's just based on the states that are reporting. Just a few, this is where we did rankings, and I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly. New Jersey and Pennsylvania did not provide, officially through the states, provide data. We were able to supplement with food scraps composting, and but they may, I think on yard trimmings, New Jersey may have the most, but we didn't include them because that was an old number that we did utilize just for counting. So Ohio comes in at the top with all composting facilities. In terms of yard trimmings plus food waste composting sites, Washington State has 55, followed by Kansas, California, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. And this is where the multiple organics composting sites come in. As I noted, it was a much higher number. And Massachusetts reported on their survey form for this year that they had 185 multiple organics and 0 yard trimmings. That's because they're not really tracking the number of yard trimmings, so they know that. So it's a little, I guess what I want to say here is that's the numbers that are reported, and we are reporting them. It's really important, and we will do, via some work with the Composting Collaborative, a deeper dive into some of this. As far as livestock manure digesters, New York State is currently leading, followed by Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, California, and Vermont. And one number I'd like to point out is that US EPA AgStar keeps a really up-to-date list of livestock manure digesters. So this is August 2017 data, a total of 240. 146 are manure only, and 94 are co-digesting with high-strength organics. In many cases might include grocery store organics or other wholesale foods. A lot of times it's industrial food processing or dairy food processing type materials. The significance of the co-digestion is that it shows that adding those materials increases biogas production and doesn't really affect the capacity of the digester. So we're definitely seeing that trend. We also asked about state organics recycling assistance programs and disposal bans, and this was 45 states in the District of Columbia reporting, and about 20 states have grant programs. Loans are far fewer, 9 states. Tax incentives, not that many. Most states of those reporting offer some kind of technical assistance and or outreach and education, to educate the residents and others in the state about their organics recycling. 7 states have diversion mandates for organics. 21 states reported yard trimmings disposal bans, and 4 states have food waste disposal bans. California has a mandate, not a disposal ban, so that we're always important to point that out. So just in concluding, some of the takeaways that we have with regard to composting, and I'm happy to answer questions on the anaerobic digestion side as well, but definitely fewer states with composting data than, when we did the state of composting in the U.S. Surveying. And some of the bigger states population-wise without composting data include Illinois, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, as well as Indiana and Missouri. So when you look at the populations of those states and the amount of development, it's a significant gap. And so one of the things that is going forward with the Composting Collaborative and independently just BioCycle is really how to better measure and track activity. And I get into that briefly in the last bullet here. The inclusion of food waste in the multiple organics category is a little bit of an assumption on our part because we didn't specifically say, does it include food waste? In some in follow-ups we did, like Massachusetts, a number of those are taking food scraps of some sort. In a state, I think it was Montana, but I have to check. It was just multiple organics. None were taking food scraps. It was primarily manure and other feedstocks. We're definitely, in terms of the number of smaller scale composting operations, clearly, although we can't prove it statistically, are lower barriers to entry. You have increasing number of states that have tiers that make it less onerous to start up a small scale food scraps composting operation, and many times less onerous permitting requirements. And in the next presentation, you'll see, based on what we're seeing in the residential food scraps composting, some really small scale but really effective composting operations. Standardizing definitions, really important. We had to do a fair amount of follow-up on the yard trimmings category, where was mulching only versus composting. There are some states where really they primarily have mulching facilities. Another is just the multiple organics thing again. So we need to fine-tune that going forward. And lastly, one way that we believe can help with tracking composting facilities is if everybody gets all in on BioCycle's portals, which are self-reporting. BioCycle findacomposter.com, and we also have findadigester.com and findorganicshauler.com. We will be working with the Composting Collaborative on the Find a Composter and some of the state organics recycling matters going forward based on BioCycle's State of Organics Recycling. We made in the October issue, that's the cover there, anybody can go to the biocycle.net website and read the preview. The report itself is a 12-page report with lots of tables, and that is available to BioCycle subscribers who have a login code. So that with the residential food waste collection report, it's going to be similar. The preview will be in December, and the report will be available to download for subscribers. So that does it. Look forward to questions after the next presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nora. It was really wonderful, and we have a slew of questions for you once we get to the Q&A. But I'd like to ask you just one as a clarification before we move on to the next presentation, and that's if you can just define for us what multiple organics means so people can process everything you just said. We had one question on that.
I actually wrote that down, how it appeared on the questionnaire. So food waste and yard trimmings, the definition is source-separated food waste, includes soiled paper, OCC or corrugated compostable products. Multiple organics defined as, for example, yard trimmings, food waste, manure, industrial organics. So what we see is, number of composting facilities, their mainstay feedstock may be yard trimmings, but they're also taking in some manure or some pre-consumer food waste or ice cream waste from a Ben and Jerry's, for example. So that's the distinction. The challenge was at the state level, we just didn't get anything beyond checking there were X number in that in that category. And if you download the full report, it goes state by state with all the data as it was reported. And we verified and followed up quite extensively.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Well, now I'd love to pass it on to Brenda and Virginia to take us through the residential side.
Yeah, well, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So thank you, Nora and Charlotte and the rest of your colleagues at the Compost Collaborative for the opportunity today to provide this overview, which is on BioCycle's 2017 Residential Access to Food Waste Collection report. BioCycle contracted with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance to undertake the survey this year. My colleague Virginia Streeter led the research, and I oversaw and directed it. I also want to do a shout out to our summer intern, Emily Saba, and our current intern, Colton Fagundes, who's really been key in us collecting this data this year. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some introductory remarks about the survey this year. Then Virginia, I'm going to hand it over to Virginia, who's going to preview some of our key findings and do a little bit of a deeper dive, especially on the curbside programs, and compare this year's growth to the results from the last survey, which was done in 2014. And then she's going to hand it back to me, and then I'm going to wrap up with some comments on the drop-off programs, which was new this year. We're really excited to share that. I think, as maybe Charlotte or Nora already mentioned, the December issue of BioCycle is going to feature this new preview, and BioCycle subscribers will have access to the full report. So as many of you may be aware, BioCycle has been tracking residential food waste collection in the U.S. for many, many years. The first survey was done in 2005, and this is actually the 8th study. It's not done every year. So, what does it cover? It includes, and I think I just want to make sure this is really clear from the very beginning, it includes programs that are actively offered or supported by local government. It does not cover private haulers who may offer subscription service, for food waste collection independent of the government, of government support or involvement or contract. Just for example, in Philadelphia, some neighborhoods may be able to sign up for curbside food waste collection. There's a couple of private haulers, Bennett Compost, Circle Compost. But as these are not city-supported programs, they are not included in the survey. So past surveys only covered curbside programs, but we've seen a growth in cities and counties offering drop-off programs. And in some areas, we're going to talk about this a little bit at the end, is that drop-off programs have become the basis for future curbside expansion. So we think they're going to be increasingly important. One thing I'll say also, just to be clear, is I know the webinar title had composting in the name, but the study intentionally doesn't, simply because some communities are sending their source-separated food scraps to anaerobic digestion facilities, which Nora just covered. And South Portland, Maine is an example of a community that's sending food waste to anaerobic digestion. So access to food waste recovery collection, there's so much growth happening all around the country. And these are just some examples of what's not included. So the top left, that's actually my daughter at her dorm, her kitchen at her dorm. So that could be, one might consider that residential food waste at a dorm, but that's done privately by University of Maryland, even though there's a container in her kitchen, so that is not covered. Public events, food trucks. The middle photo here is a drop-off that people would have access to at Urban Farm in Baltimore, but it's not city-supported, so it's not included. We also did an article last January on the growth of bike-powered food scraps collectors, and most of those, are not supported by local government. So you may be, I think we had documented something like 17. It's probably grown since then. So again, the households or neighborhoods that have access to that kind of residential food scrap collection that's not supported by local government, it's not included in the study. All right, so we have a lot of new things this year, which we're really excited to share. Virginia will talk about some of the first questions we asked is the type of program, is it mandatory, voluntary, opt-in? She'll talk about that. We asked questions like, did you give starter kits and what was involved in that? Scarsdale, New York, the photo here is an example of a drop-off program that actually provides starter kits, so it doesn't only have to be curbside. We asked about unit-based pricing for trash. We asked about disposal fees. We asked about frequency of collection for recyclables as well as organics. We did a much deeper dive on the types of materials accepted, including things like, are they certified, if you're including compostable plastics, are they certified by the Biodegradable Products Institute? We asked questions along the lines as if your program is successful. We'll give you a preview on some of those answers. And then one of the big additions, as I already mentioned, is we included drop-off programs, but again, drop-off programs that are supported by local government. And one of the other things that we asked this year, which we hadn't in the past, was to get an idea of the range of collection vehicles. So, and I'm just giving you a little preview here that they really range. I mean, we had answers, of course, rear loading, side loading, automated, semi-automated, but I thought kind of visually seeing that there's a range. And even the Packer truck from Vermont shown in the top, that's a drop-off program. And I think seeing that on load gives you a sense that even drop-off programs are collecting significant amounts. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Virginia to talk about some of the preview of some of the results.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Brenda. So I will be discussing the curbside collection programs, which, as Brenda said, has been the focus of the past 7 studies. And so we have a lot more data on curbside collection to sort of compare it to over the years. So starting off, there were a wide range in types of curbside programs. We ended up with data from 149 different programs in 20 states. And every program sort of has to adapt to its own community. So for instance, Organic Solutions in the top left is a program in Minnesota that serves a number of communities there and offers access to almost 40,000 households in Minnesota. And they're fairly unique in that they have the blue bag program. And so organics are collected in one color bag, recycling in a different color bag, and trash in a third bag. And they're all put in the same container and then separated out at a transfer facility. So that's a fairly unique way of doing it. We also, Brenda talked about the difference between a truly private collection program and government supported. So all these programs here on this page are government supported, but a number of them, the collection service is actually run by a private hauler that contracts or has some agreement with the city. So one example of that is Falls Church in the upper right-hand corner, which has just contracted with Compost Crew to collect organics throughout the city. And Compost Crew is a private collection service that operates in D.C. and Baltimore and several cities in this area. But we're only counting their Falls Church program because that's the one that's truly government supported. And so for curbside collection programs, the majority were these sort of private contract programs. So 76% of programs that we collect data from use a private hauler, and only 21% were collected by government, such as Department of Public Works, and the remaining programs use a combination of those two. This slide also shows the range in cart sizes. So again, in Falls Church, you can see this one up here is like the kitchen countertop collection for people then to put in their curbside bucket, but they also offer an option to upgrade to a larger size. So there, and we found that there's a range from 5 gallons to almost 100 gallons of curbside buckets. So that really varied depending on sort of how much the program was collecting. And then there was also a range in what the programs were collecting, which I'll get into a little bit more later. But you can see here is Davis, California, and that shows on the bucket itself what materials are accepted. So moving on to this shows the historical data from, historical data from every year that this survey was done. And you can see there is quite a bit of growth between 2014, when the last data was collected, and this year. And just to clarify sort of what this chart is showing, so I mentioned there are 149 programs reporting, but we did also count how many communities those programs are serving. So for instance, Costa Mesa Sanitary District in California is counted as one program, but 3 communities because they're serving the city of Costa Mesa, part of Newport Beach, and unincorporated Orange County. So we wanted to get more of a sense of what the volume of these programs was. And so there's been a significant growth in communities this year. And then this also breaks down the communities with access to curbside food waste collection by state. And this year, the top 3 were California, Washington, and Minnesota. And the last time, we don't have this data up, but you can see in the last study that the top 3 were California, Minnesota, and Washington. So some of it has remained somewhat the same, but all of these states have had growth. A couple states have dropped off the list that were included last time, such as Kentucky, which had 2 small pilot programs, and those did not continue. But there are 3 totally new states that have been added this year. Virginia, which I mentioned, the Falls Church Compost Crew program, and then also Idaho and Maine have started programs since the last study. So very exciting to also see sort of geographic growth in where these programs are happening. And Illinois and Vermont are also fairly significant, sort of rounding out the top 5 number of communities. And they have both grown significantly since the last time. In the last study, they each only had 1 community that had curbside collection. So this, again, shows the historical data from every year the survey was done. And again, there's a significant jump this year in the number of households being served. And just to clarify, we were really looking for numbers with access. And I'll get into this a little bit more later on, but not all these programs are necessarily serving everyone that has access. For instance, Bellingham, Washington, 19,000 households have access, but only 5,000 use the service because it's an opt-in service. So we don't have exact numbers for how many are truly using the service, but there has also been significant growth in that number too. So this is breaking down the households with access by state, and this is where you can sort of see the size of community versus the number of communities. So if you remember the breakdown of number of communities by state, Minnesota had quite a lot of communities, and here you see it's a much smaller number of households because they're all fairly small towns in Minnesota that have that program, whereas New York had only a couple, technically, communities that had access, but New York City is counted as one community, and obviously they are now serving 790,000 households as of the end of October. So they represent a large portion of the household number. So a little bit of a difference there between households and communities. Okay. And so this just shows comparison between the last survey and this year's, and you'll see that it has grown in every metric we have here: number of programs, number of communities, number of states, and number of households. That there's been pretty significant growth. So we're very excited to see that. Okay. So we also broke down programs by the scale. So I think pilot is relatively self-explanatory. So they're smaller programs. They're just sort of starting out and testing out the model. And then there are a few partial programs which are still in the process of being fully rolled out. And then the majority of programs were full-scale single-family dwelling, which means that they're serving single-family households and, in some cases, smaller multifamily households if those households receive city service, so up to, say, 5 or so households or units within a household. And then full-scale all is every single household, including multifamily buildings, are being served by curbside collection. Okay. And then this I referenced when talking about Bellingham, but there are 3 models of types of curbside programs, often standard and mandatory. And standard was the typical, so standard is it's offered to residents just alongside recycling and trash, so they don't have to do anything special to participate in the program. They just put out their organics at the curb with the recycling and trash. Often it's programs that have to, you have to sign up to participate, and so those programs tend to be where there's a difference in households served and households with access and households served, such as the programs in Minnesota and in Bellingham, because not necessarily everyone is signing up. And then a few mandatory programs, half of those are in California and one is Seattle. Those are sort of more well-known mandatory programs, but there's also a mandatory program in Illinois, Maine, and Massachusetts. So very cool to see these mandatory programs in places where there typically have not been in the past. Okay. We also, sorry, I'm having a little network connection trouble. So if you're able to advance to the next slide for me.
No problem, Virginia.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Is this slide you were hoping to discuss, or one more?
So the materials collected slide with the, yes, okay. I think it's the back one. Yep, there we go. So as Linda mentioned, we did a pretty deep dive into types of materials collected. So all programs are collecting fruit and vegetable scraps. That's sort of the starting point for collecting food. But then after that, there was a lot of variety in what programs were collecting. So we really looked closely also at compostable food serviceware and plastics, since there's been kind of a growth in those in recent years and number of products, and less than half of of programs were accepting compostable food serviceware, but it still is around 40%, so it's still quite a bit. And some more established programs, such as Seattle, were accepting a wide range of items. And you can see on the right is, there we go, is a poster from Seattle of what they accept. And they specifically say approved compostable packaging because their materials go to Cedar Grove. And Cedar Grove extensively tests what products they allow. Okay. So next, we looked at programs co-collecting food and yard waste, because in some places, communities that were already collecting yard waste, it's relatively easy for them to add in food waste. That was the case with a lot of programs in Illinois, and part of the reason that they have had such a growth of programs from last year to this, because they developed these ride-along programs with their already existing yard waste programs. However, 29% are not collecting with yard waste, so still a significant number. And you can see here 2 examples of curbside carts, and the New York City one clearly says food scraps and yard waste, whereas this one is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so it's food scraps only. And then we asked participants about why they considered their program, if they considered their program successful, and why. And the vast majority of participants that we got responses from on this did consider their program successful. And you can see meeting diversion goals as sort of the number one reason, which makes sense as we know that quite a lot of municipal solid waste is organic. And then we also asked for anyone who did not think their program was successful, why not? And only 5 programs out of all we surveyed have said they did not consider their program successful, and the majority said that was due to lack of participation, which sort of goes back to the opt-in versus standard versus mandatory, since opt-in requires a little bit more effort to get people to participate. Great. Okay, so I will hand it back over to Brenda now. But that's a preview of everything we learned about the curbside program. So lots of exciting things.
Yep. Thanks, Virginia. We had one question I'll just clarify about asking if we could re-explain the difference between standard and mandatory curbside programs. And I'll just say there was 3 options Virginia showed: opt-in, standard offering, and mandatory. So opt-in is households must sign up to take part. Standard offering is that it's offered along with trash and recycling, but participation is optional. And mandatory is it's offered along with trash and recycling, but participation is required. And that's exactly the wording we used on the survey. So that was the responses for that. Okay, so one thing I forgot to mention in my introductory remarks is that a little bit about the methodology. So I'm going to get into the drop-off program. So I just wanted to mention that to identify the new communities, we contacted each state. We provided the past list. We asked for new programs and communities. We also contacted some of the large haulers that we know are offering curbside collection, like Waste Management. They were we had a great dialogue with them and a great list, checked out all those. BioCycle issued a call for participation. Of course, we did the old-fashioned kind of Google searches and what we knew. But undoubtedly, we are missing some. So if you are not included or know of a community that isn't, this is just an open invitation to please contact us and let us know. All right, so I'm going to share some of the data on drop-off programs. Again, this is the first time, and these are government-supported programs in some way. So we identified 67 programs serving 318 different communities. And again, similar to how Virginia described the counting for the curbside, we followed the same system for counting programs and communities. So, for instance, Boulder County, Colorado is considered one program, but it has 11 communities in it. So that's why the number of communities with access to food waste through drop-off is so much larger. 15 states had programs, and the number of households with access is 6.7 million compared to with curbside 5.1. And again, I just really want to reflect, this is, to clarify, this does not reflect the actual number of households that may be participating. It's the number of households that have access to bringing their food scraps to a drop-off site. I don't have a slide on this, but I'll just share of the programs that reported the type of program, whether it was directly offered by a government agency versus contracted with a private provider. 73% were offered directly by the government agency, while only 20% were contracted with the private provider, and the rest had a mix. So this shows by the number of programs, not the number of communities or households. So this is just the number of programs for drop-off by state. Massachusetts is the leader. Minnesota is up there. But we have, these are the states, so there's a wide variation. I think it's perhaps, I found it interesting that California has very few drop-offs, at least that we were able to identify, whereas they were clearly the leader on the curbside programs. And that was all 67 programs reporting. Okay, so again, similar to the previous slide on the types of materials collected, but this is drop-off. And I was actually surprised that so many, 88%, also included meat, fish, and dairy. It wasn't just fruit and vegetable scraps. And more than half, at the last bullet here, compostable plastic bags. Not surprising, it's a little bit more than a third with compostable food serviceware items. So there's a little bit of a different breakdown for the materials at drop-off. The poster shown here is from the DC drop-off program, and that is one that does not include, dairy, meat, fish, oils, and grease. Okay, so there's a wide range of programs. I'm just going to showcase a few of them. I found it interesting that in DC, where Virginia and I are based, that two different agencies are actively participating and offering drop-off with completely different programs. The DC Department of Parks and Recs for a number of years has created these community compost sites and formed these community compost cooperative networks. There's a map there. There's 46 in all 8 wards of the city. And what you have to do, they're using these 3-bin systems, and anybody can sign up. You don't have to be in that neighborhood, and you have to take a 1-hour training before you earn the right to drop off your food scraps. And you have to agree to work like 1 hour a month for 9 months out of the year. It's also Compost Cab, which is a niche hauler in DC, also is delivering some of the food scraps they collect from their clients to a network of these sites, not all of them. I actually am one of the managers, compost managers at one of the sites. The ones, 2 photos on the bottom here are the site that I manage here, and I love that it's a way to engage youth and families in the act of composting. So it's great for that. The other, which is agency that's involved, is the Department of Public Works, and this is a program that's launched on Earth Day this year, and they are offering food waste drop-off at farmers markets in at least one in each ward of the city on Saturday. So it's usually like 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. And there they contracted with Compost Cab, which I just mentioned, which for a number of years was operating a drop-off program in the center of the city at DuPont Circle. And they were asking for a contribution of $3 per drop-off, and it was very popular, and they were offering that since 2011. So that was independent then. Now it's city-supported. They won the contract. There's something like 400 households that are dropping off at the farmers markets each Saturday. I think what's interesting about the difference between these two programs is the first one, it's 24/7. Once you take the training, you get the combo lock. You can drop off your food scraps at the site that you joined, the Compost Cooperative, but you have to be involved. Here you can just drop off. Not all the farmers markets are year-round, so there's still a question of what's going to happen when some of those close. Some of them have actually closed in November and then December. So, but it's a great way to get started. Here's a few more other examples. We have Scarsdale, New York, which just started in 2017, serving Access, small town in 5,500 households. Linwood Township is in Minnesota, is another very small town that's offering drop off, and I love that you can tell these are cold communities, or at least the one in New York, obviously in the winter. But one of the things we found is that in addition to farmers markets and community gardens, they're being offered at multi-material recycling drop-off sites, transfer stations, municipal buildings like a Department of Public Works yard, and even at the compost facility itself. So there's no one way that communities are offering drop-off. Wake County, North Carolina, so there's at least some communities in the South, we're getting some questions about that, has 11 convenience sites. This is actually a fairly big county with 450,000 households, but they have 11 convenience sites, and 4 of the sites are now, they initially started with 2, and 4 of them are now offering food waste collection. And so, people can drive in here and drop off a number of different recyclables and other materials, trash too, and then there's food waste as well. So, and they're open seven days a week. So that's just an example of kind of a more multi-material drop-off center. New York City has been operating drop-off sites at more than 50 farmers markets for a number of years. They've added subway stations more recently, and they have a map you can find, the hours and where to drop it off. And I think some of their branding on that, it's been a really important outreach tool for them. Drop off your food scraps or compost them locally. And so that has now helped them form the basis for the rollout they're currently doing on their curbside program that's now serving, as Virginia mentioned, more than, I think, 790,000 households right now as of the end of October. So the food drop-off locations are really a great outreach tool. So here's another example, South Portland, Maine, which started this year. And I thought one of the things, I just love this because it's such a great kiosk with what to do, but I thought was really noteworthy is they're doing outreach in the supermarkets where people are buying their food. So I know you can't read this little sign by the bananas, but one, it says, the steps, don't knot your produce bag too tightly. You'll want to reuse it. 2, line your food waste bin with this bag. And then 3, bring your separated food waste to the curb or designated collection point. And then there's information to contact, and the website is given. And we have other pictures. It's not just by the bananas. So I thought that was a really innovative system. Chittenden Solid Waste District, Chittenden County in Vermont, has been operating a drop-off serving, I think, 20 communities, 67,000 households have access, and it's been operating since 2001. And I thought it was, really unique in that they were, offering this bin with the wood chips. Please cover your food scraps with these wood chips. And I showed this picture earlier with the truck unloading, but, a lot of the brown you're seeing in that pile is the wood chips, which, as you can imagine, is helping absorb some of the liquid and keeping odors to a minimum. So that may be something for communities to consider. Virginia mentioned Falls Church, Virginia, as one of the, newer states that's, Virginia that is, that's has an example drop-off and a curbside program, and Falls Church is the only curbside program offering now in the state. And I think it's worth just talking a little bit. It's a fairly small community of 14,000 people, a suburb of D.C. All its services are contracted out, even for trash. They started this drop-off in August 2015, and it initially started at the farmers market, and they were immediately overwhelmed. They had a very positive reaction. The demand was incredible. So in August, a year later, in 2016, they set up this permanent drop-off sites, and the contract was awarded to pretty medium, small-scale composter Veteran Compost, which hires veterans. That's a picture of Justin, the owner, and his site in one of his sites. But he's collecting 8 totes weekly. They're also leveraging that same contract for special events. But because of the incredible response, they decided to issue RFP earlier this year for their curbside program. And I think this just kind of underscores the importance of drop-off to lead to more widespread access through curbside or other avenues like that. So they issued an RFP in February of this year that it was awarded to Compost Crew. I love that they are supporting not just one local composter, but more than one. And the Compost Crew delivered the bins in July. Collection started in August. The contractor's leading the billing and outreach. And I think what's unique about Falls Church is that they were able to add a curbside program without really increasing their solid waste budget at all. Compost Crew, people put in $6. If they want to sign up, they can sign up monthly for $6 a month or pay in advance for a year. They get the 5-gallon bucket. They can upsize to a bigger bucket and pay more. 60% actually have subscribed to the 12-gallon bucket. They can also purchase an additional kitchen caddy if they want. There's shared incentives with Compost Crew to bring residents into the program. And the city of Falls Church is paying Compost Crew an additional amount per household, but it's allowing the city, subscribers to put in some money, the city to put in some money, offer it affordably, and to bring on a new program. So I'm not saying every city, needs to do this or get, obviously people have to pay and trash is free. So maybe a disincentive, but this seems to be working for them. And 15%, a new program, have so far opted in. So I'll just say for the success of drop-off programs is I don't have a chart about this, but we did ask, do you consider your program successful? And 83% reported that they did. 17% said not sure, and only 7% said too early to tell, and nobody said it was not successful. Falls Church did ask how people heard about the curbside program, and one of the largest responses for where they heard it was through the farmers market. So again, the drop-off kind of leading to a success with curbside. When we asked why you considered if it was successful, why did you consider your drop-off program successful? 64% because it was meeting diversion goals, 52% avoided disposal costs, 32% said reduced trash frequency, and 24% said less expensive, and only 8% said it was because of the participation rate. So I think it seems like at least our contacts had an understanding that drop-offs aren't going to lead to maybe high participation rate. That's not the driver or why they would consider this necessarily a success. So I'm going to end there so we have plenty of time for questions. I just want to mention, I forgot to mention at the beginning that the Food Service Packaging Institute and the Biodegradable Products Institute contributed to BioCycle to help support this research. So thanks to them for their valuable support. Back to you, Charlotte.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Brenda and Virginia. It's so phenomenal to get a chance to walk through all of the research that you guys have done. It's really exciting to see all the development since 2014. We have a lot of questions for you guys. Nora, by the way, you're unmuted as well now. So I'd love to start with a few questions that relate to what goes in the bin and kind of bin-adjacent topics, if that sounds good to you all. So my first question is, can you discuss whether it's better, more efficient, or financially to use compostable bags as liners, or whether washing the cart in these types of programs works best?
So this is Brenda. We did not. We have data from the respondents on whether they provide liners offer it, allow compostable plastics, but we didn't specifically ask it that way. But I can just tell you through my experience, some of the contracted haulers who are switching out the bins, they swear by them as a service that people pay for. They get a clean bin, or the liners are important. We have other programs like Howard County in Maryland, which is a fairly new program, a pilot that's serving several thousands of households, and they don't require liners. People don't often use them, and you're responsible for washing out your own bin. So I can just tell you we see a variety, and they seem to be working. I don't know, Virginia or Nora, if you want to add anything.
Sure. It definitely varies, and in a handful of municipalities, they're really limiting limiting what can be put into food only to avoid getting conventional plastics along with compostable. That's not a national trend. It's happening in a few places. But generally speaking, I just was scanning an article that's in November Biocycle, because it was a community-based social marketing to try to increase participation in existing programs. But definitely program organizers and those who service it believe in many cases that you can increase residential participation by offering a compostable bag, if for no other reason than what everybody refers to as the yuck factor. It's just a cleaner way, and that households are used to using plastic bags for trash, and so by using a compostable liner for a kitchen bin and then placing that in the cart is a good incentive. So it's what we find is I have not seen any national data, so what is available is mostly anecdotal.
We have one follow-up question before moving off the topic of whether any programs allow quote-unquote normal trash bag liners, so conventional non-compostable plastics, to line the cart.
This is Virginia.
Okay.
I don't think there is a single program that allows it, just because it is a major contaminant. I certainly did not talk to anyone or find anyone in the survey answers who said they would allow any kind of conventional plastics to be mixed in with organics.
Okay, and on the topic of plastics, we have a question about compostable packaging acceptance. One participant suggesting that they're disappointed to see the relatively low acceptance of compostable packaging in the curbside residential programs. And what's the way forward with this? Do you see it increasing, decreasing in acceptance? Is that a good or bad thing from your perspective?
Well, this is Brenda. I'll start off. I'll just say that a lot of times, and this is the same with recycling, what's included depends on where it's going. So if the composting processor or the receiver could be an anaerobic digestion facility, let's say, cannot handle or doesn't want compostable ware, then the curbside program isn't going to collect it. So, in some of the mature programs like Seattle and San Francisco, that have been collecting compostable ware, food service ware, and, ban styrofoam and have the institutional policies, there's a wide range of products that are included, and the composter, is handling them. In the case of Cedar Grove, which is serving Seattle, they test all the products, they work upstream with the food service, providers to make sure they're purchasing the right ware. So, and it's key to reaching their high, zero waste or diversion goals, is including compostable food service ware. So I think, again, it's really sometimes dependent on each. It's hard to just generalize, but I do think it, a key is where it's going and what they can accept.
Sure. So one other question we have, a similar concept of something that may be key to really getting high rates of diversion is a question about multifamily. So it seems that generally speaking, multifamily access in the U.S. has typically lagged behind single-family service. Is this changing? Have you seen it change between the 2014 assessment and now?
Virginia, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can take that. I'd say there definitely has been a growth in multifamily. I think part of the reason we see it lagging behind is frequently multifamily is not serviced by the city, and since these are government programs, they don't always really have that type of relationship with multifamily buildings. So I think that's definitely limited multifamily, and I also think it requires a little more organizing in order to have like a centralized food waste collection site in the apartment building and all of that. So I'd say there definitely has been growth, but it's still not like extremely typical or sort of widespread.
Yep. And one thing I'll just say is Global Green is issuing a new report they just did on the importance of outreach and raising awareness in multifamily units. And one of their key findings is that outreach leads to significantly increased participation in diversion in apartment buildings and a decrease in the amount of food and a positive impact on the community. So they have a report coming out. Maybe when we release the recording for this webinar, we can include a link which, to that report, which examines successful strategies for implementation.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Brenda. We can certainly include it as a link, and it's also going to be on our November newsletter for the Composting Collaborative as well, in case anyone would like to check it out then. Conveniently. So one follow-up question we have is, why is New York City grouped as one community, and is it a lack of granular data?
And this is Nora. Before we answer that, I see in the chat box, I was going to point it out when the question was asked about allowance of conventional plastic, and Jennifer pointed it out that New York City in their curbside program does allow conventional plastics, and that's happy to via email explain why that is, but that is important something to point out. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, Nora, if you'd like to explain now, it is a kind of an interesting reason, especially given the size, if you'd like.
Sure. I think my recollection of the reason why, and I'm sure there are others on the call who will please correct me, has to do with convenience, that people are used to using conventional plastic bags, and that is for participation to try to encourage it. They've put in processing equipment. It's not all at transfer stations. If it's not in, it's going in to try to clean up the stream. The way I always, when we get into discussions about it, this is, if you will, there was a version 1.0 and a 1.5, and ultimately when they get to the last version, that will be compostable bags. But in this interim, where they're building participation, they're dealing with it more on the back end than on the front end.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you generally,
yeah.
Charlotte?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm on the same page there. So is towards the methodology, Brenda or Virginia, if you'd maybe be able to address the question about New York City being grouped as one community before moving on.
Yeah, I can talk about it. And it's because, we had sort of one point of contact in New York City. It's run as kind of one program, and we don't have a breakdown of data between the boroughs or between neighborhoods. So that's why we also were sort of considering communities to be either sort of an unincorporated area in a county, so like the entire unincorporated area we count as one community, or an incorporated city or town within a program. So New York City sort of is one community, and
Great.
considering it that way.
That's helpful. So a similar question about methodology of what's the rationale for limiting the scope of the study to only government-run or supported programs?
So Nora, we should probably punt to you to answer this. We at the Institute just did what was done in the previous surveys to limit it, but I think going forward it might be interesting to look at, it's tremendous growth going on in these private, subscription service providers. And we did start to gather information on that through the survey. So, but we didn't aggregate it.
Sure. And I would actually have to go back to when we started this in 2005. But it really, we were, in the 90s, there was more of a push to mix waste composting, for municipal and, just taking the whole bag of trash and running it through front-end processing and then composting and that kind of thing. And then gradually there was a push towards doing curbside collection with source separated. All these were always municipal programs, whether they were actually, like was pointed out in the beginning, they're municipally sponsored, not necessarily municipally executed. And so we have always focused on the municipal with this survey, and I think it hasn't been until the last few years that we've seen, because in some parts because of the lack of municipal programs for curbside collection, residential curbside collection, that these subscription services have popped up. And what's really cool about that is that in many instances it's grassroots, starting with bike collection, growing into a van or a truck, and maybe initially starting out with neighborhood composting sites and then a community composting, and now some of the materials going, like in the Raleigh-Durham area, going actually to an industrial scale composter. So, but they're always municipally, not those, but traditionally for us municipally initiated, and now there is this explosion that gives households access if they don't want to or cannot compost at home. So and the way to collect data on that, and that's why we said let's see what we can get out of this survey project, by asking municipalities if there are these kinds of programs in their communities, is they're diverse. It's sort of like the on-site institutional in some cases, or on-farm. They're not necessarily part of a traditional trash collection franchise. And what's interesting in New York City, the Business Integrity Commission, I think it may still be in a pilot phase, but they're the ones that regulate the carters, the haulers in New York City, is allowing, and this is more, I think, for the commercial food scraps, but, sort of allowing this more neighborhood-based collection. So everything is new, relatively speaking, and I think it's going to be very exciting to watch. And to whatever extent ILSR, with the community composting initiatives, that really tracks that, and BioCycle collaborates with them on that as well.
Thanks, Nora. So I think we have time for just one more question. So I'd like to throw this out to each of you. Looking into your crystal ball, do you expect to see the same sort of growth in the next 3 years if you guys do this study in 2020? It's pretty amazing looking back to see that growth in terms of access has moved from 2.7 million to more than 5 million since 2014. Do you see this trend continuing, increasing, decreasing?
Well, this is Brenda. I'll start off. I think we're going to see it grow exponentially. And I think we'd better if we want to, save the climate and stop trashing it. And I think, there's actually a nice thread between Nora's presentation at the beginning and the curbside, because I saw a number of states like Ohio that were, leading on the development of capacity, but aren't listed as having any, or not having very many curbside programs. So I think as capacity grows, we're going to see more. I mean, I know even in Maryland, which just has a handful of communities, the challenge and the obstacle to having more curbside is still the lack of capacity. So I think starting small, like Falls Church, when they started their drop-off, was going to a small-scale site. Other Alexandria, Virginia is another example of a program. When they first started, they were taking it to a local middle school. Now they're taking it, as it's grown to a commercial site. But, communities could start on the path with small-scale, on-site drop-off, and then grow their communities as they build support. So I think we're going to see it grow.
Wonderful. What say you, Virginia?
Yes, I definitely agree that it's going to grow. I live in D.C. and the drop-off program just started this year, but D.C. has like an $8 million budget to build a compost facility and develop a curbside program. And so, hopefully that will be included in the next one. So I think there's definitely, I think as Brenda was sort of saying, the drop-off programs are a great way to get started. And surveying the drop-off programs this year, we saw that there's really quite a lot going on in that area. And so I think that will only continue to encourage other cities to develop these programs.
Excellent.
Nora, I agree. I don't have a whole lot to add to what Brenda and Virginia are saying. I think one of the things in Illinois, for example, in the Chicagoland area where they're collecting yard trimmings curbside, they're calling them in some of those communities ride-along programs where they're adding the food scraps in with the yard trimmings, and so they're able to offer the service. So I think where there is existing yard trimmings, curbside collection and bins to be set out in, I think we'll see more there. I believe drop-off is going to explode because it's a way to give access, and you'll learn on a smaller scale and see that evolution. And in states like California, where all organics out of the landfill, by the early 2020s, this will also be happening increasingly. So it's definitely see it going up.
That's exciting. Well, I'm keeping both my fingers crossed that in 2020 we'll be back here talking about exponential growth and drop-off curbside and everything in between. So thank you guys so much to our participants for tuning in and our speakers for sharing your research today. Please look out in the next couple of days for our December webinar, whose registration will be live in the next couple of days, and to save the date for the next in-person meeting of the Composting Collaborative on Monday, January 22nd, co-located with the U.S. Composting Council's conference in Atlanta. And just another reminder that as this research is yet to be published and a sneak peek, the webinar recording won't be released until mid-December when BioCycle releases the Residential Food Waste Access Study. But looking forward to sharing slides of the first portion with you tomorrow.